Okay, so I'm Cheryl Blair, Audiology Advisor for AXAPA, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we begin today's webinar on concurrent practice, please note the helpline for technical issues in the bottom left-hand corner. And just so you know, the presentation will be recorded and available on the AXAPA website. Here are the objectives for today's webinar on concurrent practice. Please know there will be time for questions at the end of the session. So before we dive into talking about guidelines on concurrent practice, I want to bring your attention to the fact that AXPA actually has standards around concurrent practice, specifically Standard 1.6, concurrent practice. This standard indicates that a regulated member of AXAPA participates in concurrent practice only in situations in which the benefits outweigh the risks. Standards of practice are posted on the website under Key College Documents, and you can see the link on your screen. It's important to note what the expected outcomes are for the standard on concurrent practice, and that is that clients can expect that the regulated member considers their unique values and needs, explains proposed assessment and intervention procedures, and obtains informed consent. So if you're engaging in concurrent practice, ask yourself, am I meeting this expectation? So let's turn our attention now to the content of the concurrent practice guideline found on the AXAPA website under Key College Documents. We will cover the definition of concurrent practice as well as the guiding principles. And I really urge you to keep this guideline top of mind as your go-to resource if you are participating in concurrent practice. Okay, let's go over the definition of concurrent practice, otherwise referred to as concurrent intervention. As stated in the guideline, concurrent practice refers to the independent provision of clinical interventions to a client for the same or related concerns by two or more service providers. So typically, the providers are from the same profession, although they do not have to be. Concurrent practice is not to be mistaken with consecutive practice, where one clinician is involved with a client and their involvement is ceasing or ceases prior to the involvement of another clinician. So there can be many reasons for concurrent practice, and let's look at a few examples. So one example would be in audiology, where an infant or young child is followed through the public health system for hearing testing and sees an audiologist in private practice for fitting of amplification. Examples of concurrent practice in speech-language pathology are when there is a school board SLP and a private practice SLP. So caregivers sometimes seek private services to augment services offered by a school. Some confusion has existed or maybe exists regarding if this is allowed, and for sure it is, but it must be in compliance with standards. Secondly, there could be a school board SLP consultant for preschool, for example, and an AHS SLP involved with the same client. You can also have two private practice SLPs engaging in concurrent practice. This is less common, but caregivers sometimes try to compare services. So remember that it is important to check with your employer policy on concurrent practice, as often if two public providers of service, for example, two different programs, both funded by AHS or AHS in Education, are involved, this may be deemed as duplication of services according to public policies. An example of this would be when a child is referred to a community clinic and also attends a preschool program that has an SLP consultant in the classroom. I just want to stop for a minute and ask my colleague Sharia, do you have anything to add to that, Sharia?
No, I think that that covers it.
Okay, thank you. So if you are engaged in concurrent practice, what are the considerations? Please note that you will find the information I'm going to cover here in the concurrent practice guideline. Okay. Remember that the provision of services by more than one clinician must be in compliance with AXAPA's Code of Ethics, Standards of Practice, and all relevant legislation. You will want to keep in mind the responsibilities related to privacy and the sharing of information. And so you will find more information on this topic in the Concurrent Practice Guideline under Assumptions, which is on page 5 of the guideline, as well as Guiding Principles number 2 and 3 on page 6. Remember to inquire during the case history if the client or patient is receiving or is considering receiving related services. If so, it will be important to get their consent to share information regarding their condition with the other professional so that interventions and outcomes are coordinated and complementary rather than duplicated and or opposing. And you'll find this in Guiding Principle number 1 on page 6 of the guideline. If the client or patient does not give consent for the regulated member to contact the other service provider, or if contact cannot be made, the regulated member needs to determine if continuing services is appropriate and in the best interest of the client or patient. Please see Guiding Principle number 4 on page 6 of the guideline on concurrent practice. So I want to note that this does not preclude the regulated member from providing a second opinion, even though the client or patient is under the care of another regulated member. So what are the risks and benefits of concurrent practice in general? Concurrent practice will ideally offer complementary interventions in such a way as to offer benefit to the patient or client. The risk of concurrent practice is that the interventions are not complementary, but rather opposing, which confuses the client and or family and does not result in benefit. The involvement with the client or patient should be monitored by the regulated members to ensure that concurrent practice continues to be appropriate and of benefit. And this is covered under Guiding Principle number 9 on page 6 of the guideline. So what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in concurrent practice? You'll find what's appropriate and inappropriate or not appropriate in Guiding Principles number 6 and 7. So let's talk about what's appropriate. Complementary services and intervention. Provision of services that cannot be provided by just one regulated member due to funding, expertise in a particular practice area, equipment and or products, or client or patient requests for a second opinion. So when is concurrent practice not appropriate? Use of conflicting approaches or interventions, lack of communication between the providers, employee policy against concurrent practice, or when it is determined that concurrent practice is not in the client or patient's best interest. So, issues to consider. And I see that my notes are missing, so give me 1 second. I have duplications. Well, maybe I don't. Okay, notes are missing for this slide. I apologize, but basically we're covering Guiding Principle number 10, which talks about making sure that you know if accepting duplication of services is going to interfere with any funding resources that the client may have access to currently or in the future. That's up to the regulated member to know. So I want to spend a bit of time on communication. This is covered under Guiding Principle number 3. It's one of the most problematic issues in concurrent practice. So I'm referring here to the communication between the regulated member service providers and or between the providers and the client, patient, family. Because it is so important that providers are on the same page with common goals, regular discussion of rationale, developments, and monitoring of treatment outcomes should be ongoing. Important test results should be shared, of course. Guiding Principle number 3 will provide a bullet point of what items should be discussed and documented between providers who are engaging in concurrent practice. Remember that the client family should be fully informed and aware as to why they are seeing different providers and should be receiving the same messages from the providers. As well, If concurrent services are not necessary or efficient or appropriate, this must also be clearly communicated to the receiver of the services. If permission is not given, and we've covered this already, but it's worth repeating, if permission is not given by the family or client for one provider to contact and share information with the other provider, the regulated member needs to determine whether it's appropriate to continue concurrent services. So sometimes services are duplicated rather than being complementary. And this can occur when an individual is eligible for two publicly funded programs or services. This can also occur when a patient must see someone in public health, as well as someone in private practice for complementary services, but the health professionals decide to redo interventions that have already been taken care of by the other professional. It is important in these cases for the regulated members involved to reflect on the services they are providing and the services the client family may also be receiving in order to not confuse them, to not waste resources and time, and to not risk the provision of opposing interventions. An example of this would be when hearing aids are adjusted to different settings by two different providers. Note that the AXLPA Concurrent Practice Guideline does not say that clinicians cannot work on the same goals, speech sounds, for example, but that the treatment approaches must be complementary. So you might recognize this slide from another webinar, but it bears repeating that documentation of services provided and outcomes is key. How concurrent care is managed should be documented. This includes, for example, communication with the other clinician and informed consent to share information. Items to be documented are covered in guiding principles number 3, 5, 8, and 11 of the Concurrent Practice Guideline. Okay, so I want to talk about managing difficult conversations. And this happens when regulated members disagree with an aspect of the services or intervention being provided. When this happens, they must make every attempt to be reasonable and to resolve these disagreements between themselves. So consider the harm. Many of you have experienced this or aware of this, the harm and the erosion of trust that speaking of another professional services in a negative way to the patient and or family creates. Remember our code of ethics, which requires that regulated members will maintain respectful relations with colleagues and other professionals and exhibit professionalism in all of their interactions. If disagreements between the regulated members cannot be resolved, this information should be communicated in a neutral and respectful manner to the client and options provided. The client's fully informed decision regarding their choice of options should be respected. So please refer to guiding principle number 11 on pages 7 and 8 of the Concurrent Practice Guideline for a more complete list of what to do in the case of an unresolved disagreement. Remember to keep the client and family as the top priority. You can ask yourselves, are we, as the providers of concurrent care, communicating with each other often enough and efficiently enough? Is the client or family adequately and consistently informed? Is their time being respected? Is everything being done for their benefit? Does the client family know why they're having to see more than one provider? Is there adequate communication all around? Are the providers engaging in ongoing monitoring and communication in order to remain on the same page so they can provide consistent and efficient care? So guiding principle number 8 on page 7 of the Concurrent Practice Guideline indicates that a concurrent intervention is judged to be unnecessary. Regulated members should clearly communicate this to the client as well as document it. I know I've repeated that, but thought it was worth repeating. I really appreciate your comments and questions. And we are here for you if you'd like to reach out at a later time. Otherwise, I think we could say good afternoon and thanks for coming.